Hi, thanks, Lori, and welcome everybody. Glad to be here. I'm just going to be giving a state update on what Maryland's been doing for brook trout. I started in this role in 2019. Some of you folks probably know Alan Heft and Matt Sell. They both left the Coldwater manager and brook trout specialist position, and we've since filled that with Matt Lawrence, who's here today, and we'll have another person in Matt Sell's role starting in May. So a lot of turnover, a lot of good things in Maryland. Next slide, please. So just a quick background, brook trout conservation in Maryland is guided by our brook trout fisheries management plan. It was written by Alan Heft in 2006. Primary goal is to restore and maintain healthy brook trout populations in Maryland's freshwater streams and provide long-term social and economic benefits from a recreational fishery standpoint. Currently, we have about 317 known catchments of brook trout occupied, which encompasses about 1,017 square kilometers or 854 stream miles. So a lot smaller than most states except maybe Rhode Island, but we got a lot of resources, and that's indicated in blue on the map at the bottom. Those are where brook trout are currently present. Next slide. Brook trout resources in Maryland are protected by adhering to existing Coldwater regulations. So we have use 3 water quality standards, which is regulated by Maryland Department of Environment. So any stream that has temperature under 20 degrees Celsius for less than 10% of the summer period from June 1 to August 31st, those, and also have wild trout present, can be classified as use 3 protection. On January 2021, and this was on the heels of our 5-year assessment, which I'll touch on in a second, we passed catch and release regulations for all waters east of Interstate 81. And in put and take stock trout waters west of 81, the rationale for the put and take is because our western counties are actually doing pretty good from a brook trout standpoint. We do not stock hatchery raised brook trout, so we didn't want augmented pressure on these fisheries by stock trout anglers to harvest incidentally brook trout. So we have a lot of signage up to inform anglers. Brook trout reintroduction efforts are currently underway in watersheds where they were previously extirpated or existing habitat and water quality conditions appear suitable for brook trout, and I'll also touch on that. Fishery staff work directly and regularly with other state and federal regulatory agencies as well as Trout Unlimited to improve relationships and ensure conservation, protection, of brook trout habitat. And lastly, of course, Maryland is a signatory partner with the Chesapeake Bay Agreement, which includes an outcome goal of an 8% increase in allopatric brook trout. Next slide, please. So talking about the Chesapeake Bay Agreement goal, in order to reach that goal, we had to first get a pretty good updated baseline. So starting in 2014, we set out on a 5-year statewide survey to assess all known brook trout populations that we had records for dating back to 1987. Out of 456 known catchments, we were able to sample successfully 440. The remainder of those were permission issues on private land, but we're hopefully going to be able to check those boxes off soon. Yeah, so records between 1987 and 2014 using both qualitative and quantitative electrofishing methods. At the end of the 5-year survey in 2018, we documented an apparent 27% loss. If you look at the map insert to the right, that's Baltimore and Carroll County. Anything in orange is where brook trout were present, but were not detected during the 5-year survey. And then the green is still present. So if you look at this little patch here on the right, you see that green insert. It's kind of an elevation phenomenon as well as land use. Those are our most urban counties where we have brook trout. So it's kind of just encroaching to the last higher elevations in those regions. And I'll just note that Maryland, at least that I'm aware of, has the southernmost Piedmont or low elevation population on the East Coast. Next slide, please. Looking at statewide assessment more closely, you can just click through, just go ahead and click, yes, right there. So if you look at our western region, these are Allegheny and Garrett counties. We saw the least amount of decline. It was about 15%. Anything in red is where we lost. Our West 2 regions, which is Frederick and Washington County or the Catoctin Mountains, we saw a 20% decline. And then again in our central region, which is Carroll, Hartford, and Baltimore County, we saw almost a 50% decline statewide. So that was our new baseline for the Chesapeake Bay Agreement. So we actually had a lot more loss than we anticipated. Next slide. So based on these depressing results, we set out on a conservation framework to address not only the loss, but to ensure adequate protection, restoration, and conservation efforts moving forward. So we adopted a three-pronged approach, which was resiliency, protection, and restoration. Our resiliency pillar is identifying those watersheds that will provide the greatest opportunity for brook trout persistence into the future, aka our strongholds in the state. And this is an effort to direct restoration efforts to these watersheds where we know if we fix a riparian zone or fence cattle out, that brook trout will colonize because they're already in the immediate area. Our protection pillar, this covers current Coldwater designation policies. So working with MDE and our partners, our local SCDs and county governments to ensure that any construction, stormwater projects, impounded waters are not increasing temperature regimes or deleterious water quality impacts in these counties where we're already losing brook trout populations and they're in decline. And then the last one is restoration, or it could be called reintroduction, but that's identifying candidate streams where temperature, water quality, and habitat have improved to suitable conditions. Next slide. So starting with the first pillar, resiliency, this made us, we took on a statewide patch assessment just in Maryland, similar to what EBTJB did, but we adopted 5 qualitative scoring criteria. Those were allopatry, public land ownership, abundance. This was based on long-term monitoring data for the streams that we had population data for, effective population size or the diversity of your adult spawning stock, and then private land conservation easement. So this combined both genetics, population monitoring, and GIS data to essentially score all of our known patches with these 5 ranking criteria. And if it checked off a box that met the criteria, and any patch that met at least 4 of the 5 was considered our most resilient or stronghold populations in the state. If you look at this table here, the ones highlighted in the green, those were the only 10 in the state that checked at least 4, and actually only 1 watershed checked off 5. That was the Upper Gun in our central region. This red circle here on the data gaps column, this is what's directing our future monitoring and management work to, if we have a stream or a patch that does not have information, genetic information, or enough years of data on abundance, that we need to collect that information to complete this for all of our known populations. Next slide. So why resiliency? It's applied approach, again, best of the best. It enables us to target watersheds for public land acquisition and brook trout watersheds where public access is lacking. We're funded by licensed dollars. We want to make sure we're not just protecting brook trout, but as Nat mentioned earlier, getting them to a better fishable condition. Allows us to work with local land jurisdictions and landowners to target stream sections for habitat restoration. We've already actually identified parcels from our Coldwater resources mapping tool and sent that landowner information to counties for riparian plantings. So we haven't heard back on that, but that gives us that capability. Currently, there's 15,000 acres or hectares in the state just within brook trout streams of unforested riparian buffers, which has cost approximately $96 million if we could just carpet bomb the whole state and reforest overnight. The N sub E criteria for that patch assessment, this enables us to identify connectivity issues. We set the bar at 50 effective population size, so anything below that gives us more precise information, actually going to the stream and watershed to identify barriers or connectivity issues as well. And then we're also looking into genetic rescue research and for reintroduction efforts from that standpoint. Next slide. I'll skip this for time's sake. Next slide. Protection, again, ongoing review process for water withdrawals, construction, stormwater projects. We've worked with MDE. I think Jonathan Lehman's on the call for TMDL development. So this is thermal protection in use-free waters that counties and local governments are going to have to adhere to if they have an MS4 permit to meet use class 3 standards. So you're essentially developing a watershed improvement plan to meet temperature criteria. We're working with abandoned mines. We actually have a meeting coming up next week, I believe. MDE is getting an extra $5 million a year for A&D funding and restoration. So we're going to hopefully adopt an MOU between us and fisheries to prioritize the additional 170 some miles of A&D streams left in Western Maryland. Next slide. I can skip that. Next slide. I think I already touched on this. Yeah, I got ahead of myself. Sorry about that. This is, well, I'll just touch. So this is related to MDE, AMD issues. For instance, we can take now a watershed restoration approach and identify reaches of stream that are listed as pH impaired, and then prioritize based on our brook trout data where we want to see lime dosers or sand dumps go in so that we can connect the most amount of habitat. Because talking with MD, they're just looking at water quality data. Yeah, it's pH impaired. I can get a doser here. I'm going to put it, but there's no brook trout within, a watershed. So we're trying to overlap both our data sets collectively. Next slide. As far as our Chesapeake Bay agreement goal, so far we successfully reintroduced one stream, Winegrenner Run, which was treated for AMD. That contributed to about 8% of our total watershed goal, which is 51 square kilometers increase to meet the Chesapeake Bay agreement by 2025. Decisions to reintroduce brook trout are going to be based on temperature and water quality, and the source stock information is going to be based on health screening information as well as genetic information that we currently have in our database. We actually have a MOU we're working on with U.S. Fish and Wildlife out of Lamar to continue genetics working. Next slide. So getting into some of the reintroduction work, we're taking a semi-modeling approach, or it is a modeling approach, based on land use and habitat features that we have for over 1,200 stream records within the MBSS database to help prioritize and predict whether or not brook trout are present or not within these watersheds. So just a couple examples. If you look at percent forest cover on the bottom left, we have about 80% of our brook trout populations above 80% forest cover. And where's another one? No, that's the best one on here, but yeah. Next slide, please. So based on the 1,200 records of data from the MBSS and DNR fisheries database, I took a categorization and regression tree modeling approach. So we dump in all these input parameters like water quality, land use, habitat metrics that MBS has standardized methods for conducting their summer stream surveys. And I just simply had a response variable of whether brook trout were present or if they aren't present. So the model itself picked out, I believe, 8 variables that were most important to predicting brook trout presence. The most important was altitude. We kind of assume that higher temperatures or higher elevation, lower temperatures. Anything less than 270 meters in altitude, the next most important variable was forest cover. So it set a threshold of about 64%. That matches other studies. I know Ty Wagner in Pennsylvania, I believe, had a paper on that. I believe the Huddy paper also documented 60 to 70% forest cover. Moving back to the right, anything above 270 meters, the next important variable was riffle quality scores. If it was greater than 9 and had low row crop coverage and good in-stream epiphytal substrate, we had 93% brook trout occupancy, or 149 of all of our 1,200 streams met these records. So there's 2 uses for this modeling approach. One is to model the most important factors for brook trout presence and distribution across the state. The second tool is to take our reintroduction candidate streams where we know they're not present and plug in this land use and water quality information to predict whether or not they're present or not. It's not the end all be all, but it's one more desktop tool we can use before we actually go out into the stream and start wasting source stocks that we don't have a lot of if we're not sure they're going to make it. One last figure here. We're also working with Van Hitt looking at paired air to groundwater temperature relationships. So this figure on the right You have mean daily air on the x-axis versus mean daily water on the y. Our gray circles here with the orange line, those are streams where brook trout are present, and our black circles is where brook trout are absent. So we see a much lower x-intercept indicating lower groundwater inputs or cooler temperatures feeding the stream. So that really stuck out on that relationship. Next slide. So moving forward with this reintroduction plan, we're going to be conducting fish health assessments on at least 3 major source stock populations, the Upper Savage River, of course, Fishing Creek watershed, and likely the Upper Gun. We have to collect 60 fish just to make sure there's no known bugs or diseases that we want to introduce into new watersheds. We're also awaiting some genetic recommendations from the staff workshop that occurred last fall, but we do have, Maryland has a pretty good database of genetic information already. And I just want to touch real quick, if I'm doing okay on time, I'm not sure, but something else we've been working on is delineating watershed and land use inputs directly upstream of HOVO temperature loggers. And I had this idea, but I'm not a GIS guy, so it took me a lot of fumbling around to figure it out. The biggest thing is the files are too large and my computer's too slow. So I have 12 county DEMs that I've converted to flow accumulation files where you can identify the stream layers, and then you can snap your temperature GPS locations to the stream layer and then delineate the watershed directly upstream. The whole point of this is to hopefully model summertime temperatures down to those logger locations based on forest cover and other things like slope and stream width and what other variables we want to put in. But I haven't gotten to the output yet because my computer is not able to handle it. But I was just curious if we had time to discuss at some point if any other states or anyone was working on this or had any interest in doing this. Next slide. And this is just a kind of a visual of what I'm talking about. This is just the Upper Gun watershed across 2 counties, but all these yellow dots are temperature locations. So I've delineated watersheds upstream in these orange polygons, and then clipped land use by the 50-meter riparian buffer upstream and just looked at forest cover versus non-forest cover. So hopefully trying to predict temperatures downstream with this information. Next slide. And then this is just pretty much all of our monitoring data is currently available on the web server. It's a GIS map with all of our brook trout, brown trout information across the state, temperature locations, etc. So it's a very useful tool. Counties and the public can look at this and just, if they have a project in an area, they can click it and see if there's brook trout present. So I think that's my last slide. Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, that was fantastic. A lot of real science and data and analysis behind what you're doing there in Maryland. I think we have time for one question.
There's a raised hand in the chat. Stephen Faulkner has raised his hand. Stephen, if you'd like to unmute, you can ask your question.
Am I supposed to finish this one?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, just real quick, Dan, what was the baseline for the loss, those loss estimates that you gave, the 27%? Was that based on the 2014 census or an earlier date?
Oh, yeah, it's based on all records of brook trout that we had from 1987 to 2013. So at some point over those, I can't do math right now, 30 years, I'm saying, we had a record of brook trout in there, which was 456 catchments. From 2014 to 2018, we went back and tried to survey all of them. We only got to 440, but it was 96% completion. So we, based on the 5-year resampling period, we think we lost 27% of the populations that we had documented going back to 1987.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
So it's a moving baseline, constantly. And I forgot to mention, we have an ongoing eDNA SWIG project, working with UMCs out of Frostburg, Bob Hildebrand, but we're trying to validate densities of brook trout as well as distance downstream to be able to detect presence. So hopefully, and I think we're going to get a eDNA sampler in the next year at some point to be able as another monitoring tool.